Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our disaster webinar series. Today, we're going to hear about the history of legal aid response to disasters with Andrew VanSingel and Leslie Powell Boudreaux. Andrew is the special advisor to the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services Program. In addition, he's the local taxpayer advocate for Taxpayer Advocate Services in Chicago and the author of the 2019 Turo Law Review article, The Calm Before the Storm, 45 Years of the ABA Young Lawyers Division Disaster Legal Services Program. Leslie Powell Boudreaux is the Executive Director of Legal Services of North Florida. LS&F provides civil legal assistance throughout the 16 counties in the Florida Panhandle. Leslie has extensive experience responding to disasters as a staff attorney, a managing attorney, and now as an executive director. I'm Kathy Grunwald, the disaster coordinator attorney here at Legal Services of North Florida, and my co-host today is Carlin Selders, who is our disaster program assistant. So before we get started, I have a couple of little housekeeping things. The program, as you can see, has been approved for Florida CLE credit. The CLE reference number is on the slide, but when I send you a link to the recording and any material that we have, I'll also send you the CLE course number again. After the webinar, you're going to get a short evaluation or survey. Only takes a couple of minutes. I'd appreciate you taking the time to send that back to us. The webinar is being recorded, and as I said before, I'll email you the link to that recording and any material by Monday of next week. If you have questions today, if you type them into the QA tab on your dashboard, and we'll answer them during the presentation if possible, and at the end if time permitting. Finally, I thank you for joining us today, and I hope you'll come back. We'll be having one of these webinars for the next 7 weeks on Thursday at noon Eastern time. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Andrew VanSingel.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Just a quick introductory remark. I am speaking today in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the taxpayer advocate or the federal government. So I got a couple of slides here I wanted to go over to kind of assist our discussion on the history of the Disaster Legal Services Program, which you may not have known has been going on for about the last 50 years. So before we get into that, I had a question, and maybe you can put it in the chat box. How many Category 5 hurricanes do you think made landfall in the United States? If you want to just take a quick minute to jot down a number. And Kathy, you're going to have to tell me what numbers are coming in the chat box because I'm in presenter mode. What do you see? Are people awake? 4? Okay. So there was actually 5 of them, and it's a little bit controversial because based on my research, most sources actually say 4, but there was one in Puerto Rico. So it may be that they meant continental United States, but there was 5 of them. There was...
we had somebody guess 5.
Oh, very good. Now, what about in Florida? We'll switch it to how many of those 5 were in Florida? What do we think?
Wow. We have 3 and 4 and 2.
Okay, so the most recent one you may recall was Hurricane Michael. The one before that was Hurricane Andrew. And the one before that was the Labor Day hurricane. And then those were the 3 that were in Florida. So if you guessed 3, you were correct. So one of the first ones that hit the continental United States was the Labor Day hurricane. So the National Hurricane Center officially began naming hurricanes in 1950 using the military alphabet before moving to a pre-selected list of female names in 1953. And it wasn't until 1978 male names were added to the list. So there's a little bit of trivia there. So Let's go back to July 1969. Some of you may have been alive. Some of you have been maybe young. But this is, my astronaut history is not very great. So I don't know if this is Neil Armstrong. I was going to say Lance Armstrong. That would have been really bad. But the US put men on the moon in July of 1969. 1 month later, Hurricane Camille hit the Gulf of Mexico and made landfall in Waveland, Mississippi as a Category 5 hurricane. Now at the time, Camille was only the second Category 5 to make landfall in the continental United States. The one before that again was the Labor Day hurricane. Had sustained winds of 180 miles per hour and storm surges as high as 26 feet. It pretty much leveled the entire Gulf Coast, killed 239 people and did billions of dollars in damage. So as a result of that, the Mississippi Young Lawyers section stepped in and took some action by creating this disaster relief committee. And there's a gentleman named Len Blackwell who put together this disaster relief committee. And so a lot of the comments that I have today are based on the law review article that Kathy had mentioned. So if the history of this program is interesting, I would really recommend you go and read that. And it was a fascinating project to work on because the people like Len Blackwell and Harry Hathaway, which I'll talk about here in a moment, were still alive. They're in their mid to late 80s. And so I got to interview them and get firsthand accounts of their work on this project. So after Hurricane Camille, there was another disaster, the Buffalo Creek flood, which when I was in law school, they gave us this list of books you should read if you want to go to law school, if you're in law school. And one of them was about the Buffalo Creek flood. And I didn't read the book then, but I still remember seeing that. And it's like, wow, when I was going through and researching, I was like, why does that sound familiar? And so it's a pretty interesting tort case about liability, because what happened was this coal mine built a dam and the dam was faulty. It gave out and it pushed millions of gallons of this coal slurry water downstream and it essentially just destroyed the entire community. And so the ABA stepped in. The Buffalo Creek is in West Virginia, and so they stepped in and did a pilot legal relief program there. And as a result of that, you know, the ABA from a national standpoint got the thinking that there's probably a need for a program, a national program to address the needs of disaster survivors. So here is a photograph of George A. Lincoln, who was in the Nixon administration, and he was the director of the Office of Emergency Preparedness, and you can kind of see that seal in the background. And so that program had kind of morphed along the years. I think it was in DHS, it was the National Disaster Assistance Agency before going to FEMA. So this is essentially at the time, the equivalent of FEMA. And so on the right is Harry Hathaway, and he was the, instrumental in getting this program off the ground. And so they signed this agreement in January of 1973, which essentially created this agreement where, OEP or FEMA today provided a $50,000 grant to the ABA to help train people across the country and make them better attuned to the legal needs of disaster survivors. So later on that year, I think it was in April of 1973, with this new agreement, some of these lawyers from across the country were doing some of these regional trainings. And so in Arkansas, they did one of these trainings. And so they got attorneys from all across the state to participate in one of these trainings. And as fate would have it, 16 days later, an F4 tornado went through Jonesboro. And so the timing was very serendipitous, because they had just done the training, and we'll kind of maybe talk about that either in this program or programs later in the series. Timing is everything. You get volunteers that say, I want to help, but then by the time you need them, they're nowhere to be seen. So this was, good timing, bad that the disaster happened, but at the time, this is the opening quote I have in the article, which was from the immediate past president of the Arkansas Bar Association, which really talks about how great this program is, and that he's worked on programs in the past and nothing really gave them the sense of satisfaction as helping disaster survivors. And I put this on here because that was one of the themes of everyone that I talked to. I interviewed probably 50 or 60 people who were involved in this program over the past 60 years or 50 years, and they all resoundingly said this is one of the, if not most meaningful things that they have done as an attorney. And so these were people that included, ABA president, federal district court judges. And so they always kind of go back to their involvement with this program. So the program kind of went on for the next 20 years. And then we had Hurricane Andrew hit in 1993. And this was a kind of a meaningful point in time for the program, because after this hurricane, the agency was now FEMA, so they kind of went back to the drawing board and expanded the relationship with FEMA and the ABA Young Lawyers Division. And so I just want to take a moment to pause, because I think now we're starting to get into Florida territory. And so Leslie, I think you said that you were in law school during this time. What can you tell us about your experience during Hurricane Andrew?
Sure. So I was in law school. I was still living in North Carolina at the time. I had a friend who had actually just started University of Miami School of Law at the same time, and it got delayed. They actually they paused her coming down, and she wasn't able to actually start class because of all the devastation from Hurricane Andrew. What I learned from Hurricane Andrew, I started at Legal Services of Greater Miami. I did an internship there in 1994, so 2 years after landfall, and so was able to work with many of the people who were on the ground. As anyone who has done disaster recovery work knows, especially a storm the size of Andrew, recovery is not a two-month or a 6-month or a 1-year thing. Oftentimes with major storms, it is 5+ years before all recovery is really at what one would call completion. And so I was able to work with them during that internship, and then in my first year of practice with Legal Services in Miami, to do some of this recovery. And what really came out of that, I mean, obviously it was a phenomenal undertaking to deal with all of the devastated homes. There's the only case law that I'm still aware of in Florida that deals with the tenant's right to terminate the lease falling with the tenant and not the landlord comes out of Hurricane Andrew. But what really came out of it was a core of attorneys, legal aid attorneys in Miami, and the volunteers that Andrew's talking about really worked together to build those bridges and decided that there needed to be a more organized effort. And so people like Terry Coble, Chuck Elsesser, Arthur Rosenberg, many others were really engaged in that work. And Terry in particular worked to create a disaster legal assistance manual. And she developed the first draft of that. She wanted to make it something that was accessible to any attorney and any legal professional who had never done this work before. They could access that information on FEMA benefits, on emergency food stamps, on insurance and title, and all of these other issues that come up that someone may have never dealt with in their own practice. They would be able to step in and help a hurricane survivor. And a lot of that came out of the lessons learned out of Hurricane Andrew. And I was one of the fortunate ones who was able to learn from them. I think most of the people who were really key to creating those systems have now retired or moved on to other professions or other positions. But it really was critical to that building, as Andrew said, of the partnerships.
And so after, and so we skipped a lot in the history. We essentially went from 1973 to 1993. And so there's lots of, implementations that happen across the country for, floods, fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, some pretty interesting stories that happened after the Loma Prieta earthquake, which I think actually happened during You know, we're still playing baseball right now, but that happened during Game 5 of the World Series, which was between the Oakland Athletics and I think the LA Dodgers. And so that event actually was kind of instrumental in saving a tremendous amount of life, because everybody had kind of left work early or stayed in the city and wasn't on the main causeway that got people out of the city, and that bridge actually collapsed. And so several people did lose their life, but it's just interesting how, you know, again, timing is everything. I think they said the same thing with the earthquake in Anchorage, Alaska. It was the time of day, it was early in the morning. It was before everybody was kind of on their way to school. It was during a shift change. So a lot of the police, fire, emergency personnel, they were overlapping in shifts. So everybody was kind of on, you know, on standby. And so in those situations, the timing, if it's ever going to happen, was somewhat fortuitous. So I think Andrew was really the start of this concept of doing these hotlines. And I think a lot of the program worked, especially in the 70s and early 80s, when everything was so tied to a landline. A lot of these things were face-to-face. It may have been what I quoted in the article of just saying hand-holding, kind of giving legal information. And so now I think we're starting to see this evolution into this program really taking on more substantial work. And I think that was part of the recognition with FEMA and the ABA, is that we need to provide more robust funding for these hotlines and to do the training for the district representatives. And that's really when that really started. And so this is pulled from the ABA Journal, I think back in the November 92 or the November 93 issue, talking about the ABA's involvement in disaster relief work after Hurricane Andrew. And pictured here is Beth Bloom, who's now a federal district court judge in the Southern District of Florida. And at the time, she had, I think she was chair of the Florida Wildee Disaster Committee, and she actually lost her home completely. It was completely leveled after Hurricane Andrew. And so that's another important takeaway here in terms of just volunteering in general, is that you need to have a plan for yourself. If you want to be a good volunteer, you may need the help that you're going to be rendering to people as well. So being prepared, having a good disaster plan and business continuity plan, those are all very important things, and things that the ABA Standing Committee on Disaster Response and Preparedness, we have resources on that. And if we have time at the end, I'll get into a little bit more about that. But when I was speaking to Judge Bloom, she said, really right off the bat, they put together those hotlines and really got to work. Mike Bedke, who is I believe a board member with Bay Area Legal Services, he was involved. I think he may have been the Wildee, the larger division's chair at the time. And he recounted a story of essentially driving from Tampa area to Homestead, just kind of him and his friend packed up the van, packed up supplies and drove to Homestead, and saying it was really like a war zone, and offering to provide legal services. And I think another theme or takeaway of the programming you'll see here is not a lot of people, I think maybe more so now, but they don't connect that there's legal needs after a disaster. And so when they got to where FEMA was kind of setting up, said, hey, we're the attorneys, we're here to help, they just kind of looked confused. And so he said he kind of had like a piece of discarded cardboard and wrote free legal help, and they kind of shuffled them outside. And I think once they saw that, hey, people were walking up to these guys and needing this legal advice, I think they brought them into the recovery center. And so again, that's why I think really Andrew is kind of that point in time where we see that progression. So fast forward to the Oklahoma City bombing. I put this slide in here because this was one of the most fascinating stories of all the interviews that I did, which was in one of the first acts of terror that we responded to. After the incident, there was, I think, at least 150 people that were killed in this explosion. of which I think there was in the double digits of children, because there was a daycare at the first floor of this building. And so a lot of federal buildings at the time had daycares for their workforce. And so since then, this forced a lot of buildings to kind of rethink that. And if you go to a federal building now, you know, I work downtown Chicago, you'll see these concrete pillars. Those were all put in because of the Oklahoma City bombing, so that a similar incident couldn't happen, that somebody could just drive up right next to the building with some sort of explosive device here. And so if you have a chance to go to Oklahoma City, they've done a tremendous job turning this into a fantastic memorial. And part of this building still stands there. And so it's quite somber, but in the bottom left corner, I think you can see there's a little tree there, and I can't remember what it's called. I think it's, but there's a name for that tree, and that tree sustained the blast. And it's still there today, and they actually, they take the seeds from that, and they sell those seeds, and so you can kind of have a part of that survivor tree, I think is what they call it. And so that's pretty interesting from that. Mike Bedke was telling me that part of the work that they were doing, one of the most kind of memorable one was they went to a judge's, you know, a volunteer went to a judge's house at 10 or 11 o'clock at night to get the judge to sign off on guardianship papers, because, you know, this child, this very young child, parents were killed in the terrorist attack, and this would allow them, you know, the child to live with her aunt and uncle. So there's really no limit to the type of legal needs that come up. And I think that's something that will come out from this this program series here as well, is that a lot of the legal needs we think of, you know, landlord tenant, but there's lots of really nuanced issues that happen. And I think COVID-19 is going to bring about more of those nuanced issues. So unfortunately, Oklahoma City was not the last terrorist attack that we had to respond to. And so this is a photograph of a restaurant called Windows on the World, and it was at the top of the World Trade Center. And interestingly enough, the ABA held its annual meeting in New York City in August of 2000, so 13 months before the World Trade Center attack. And they had their gala event. So every year at the annual meeting, it's kind of their marquee fellows gala. They had it here at this restaurant called Windows on the World. And so the current, while the disaster legal services coordinator, I had reached out to him, and he said, it's just kind of crazy to think that we were standing at, you know, Windows on the World a year prior to this, and after the terrorist attack, with some of the legal needs that arose after that, was in fact some of the employees who worked at Windows on the World who were, you know, non-citizens. And so they were very afraid to seek federal assistance because of their citizenship status. So it was a very significant effort, because it involved, you know, most disasters up until this time, I think, dealt with one state, whereas the World Trade Center attack in Metro New York City and Washington, D.C., that involved a lot of people from surrounding states, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, D.C., Maryland. And so they really had to kind of coordinate with a lot of different states and overlapping disaster plans. So I think their hotline at the time, they handled over 1,000 calls to provide legal assistance, in addition to the clinical work that was done during that time. So now, you know, that was 2001. And so from 2001 to 2005, you know, kind of the big marquee event, obviously for most people when they think of disasters, is Hurricane Katrina. But prior to Hurricane Katrina, and even in the same year of Hurricane Katrina, there was just a tremendous amount of named hurricanes or tropical storms that went through the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and specifically Florida. So Leslie, talk to me about all of those, you know, from in the early 2000s up to and right after Hurricane Katrina. Tell me about kind of what significantly happened with the legal response in Florida as a result of these hurricanes.
Sure. So the thing that for me happened was I moved from South Florida to North Florida, and was fortunate enough to have, again, had that experience working with people who've been recovering from other storms, who were maintaining the disaster manual. I, got a chance to update some of those sections, even though South Florida really didn't have any direct hits between 92 and 2005 or 2004, if you really want to count the Keys in there. There were some close brushes. There were certainly some tropical storms. There were, and I hesitate throughout this whole discussion, there are so many other floods and tornadoes and other things that people are impacted by that we're not going to have time to touch during this discussion. But if you look at FEMA's website, they'll give you a list of every declaration that happened, both emergency declarations and major disaster declarations. In 2004, which is the screen that you have in front of you, it's very colorful because there were 4 storms that crisscrossed across the entire state of Florida, and obviously even hit some of the Carolinas and Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. I lived in Pensacola when Hurricane Ivan hit on September 16th, 2004. If you've been through a hurricane, what you'll know is the east side is the strong side, and Pensacola was the east side of the storm. It did significant damage and took out the I-10 bridge, lots of things that one would expect from a storm, but also things that were really unexpected. And so in terms of the legal response, there really wasn't anybody in North Florida who dealt with the legal response before, as Florida's unique in that many people forget it has a panhandle. It's in a completely different time zone. It's a completely different, it's not South Florida, Orlando, which many people think of when they think of Florida. It's lovely beaches, lovely communities, wonderful people, but it was very new to respond to a storm of this level of destruction. There was a private attorney named Bob Kerrigan who actually set up a hotline specific for Hurricane Ivan, and we as a legal aid program helped to provide information, and it was staffed exclusively by pro bono volunteer attorneys. The partnership with ABA YLD and FEMA and others, really where that was critical for all of these storms was we had trouble getting into the shelters. We had trouble getting into the disaster recovery centers because of some of the same stories that Andrew shared out of Hurricane Andrew, where they weren't really sure where to put us, and there was this other agreement and we didn't know what to do. And being able to leverage those relationships and talk to people who were talking to people who were making those decisions really made it possible for us to set up tables and provide advice and counsel and legal assistance. We had one attorney who in Gulf Breeze, which is just outside of Pensacola Beach, who for 2 years sat at that table once a week and gave advice to so many different clients and really helped so many different people in that process. What also happened in 2004 is that was really when Florida realized that we needed to start talking about a statewide response. So we set up as legal aid programs a disaster listserv and what we call umbrella group, an opportunity for us to all speak from all of these different programs that were affected by all of these different storms. You can see in mid-Florida, Orlando basically got crisscrossed 3 times with 3 different storms. And so we were able to work together to share information, what we were hearing from FEMA, what we were hearing from state government, what we were finding out in terms of changes to eviction protocols and laws. And, much like we're doing now with COVID, things were changing on a regular basis for several months and even years into the storm. And one other thing that I really want to highlight is that, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit further on, is that the regulations and the laws were very different then. 18 months after Hurricane Ivan hit, there was this presumption that the transitional housing program the temporary housing program would end, and there were all these mobile homes that were located in all these different places across Florida, and they were too expensive to move. The parks had been set up as temporary parks. They didn't have the capacity to maintain permanent structures. And so they actually offered some of those mobile homes for sale to the people who were living in them, or to nonprofits who could relocate them, or to businesses who could relocate them to other areas. And it actually developed some permanent affordable housing in some of these areas. There's certainly questions of whether that housing was safe, whether it stayed on land that was safe to live on, and other things. But it was a very different response in 2004 than what would happen and be changed by Hurricanes Katrina and Superstorm Sandy's response as well. So, but I think those partnerships with YLD were really critical in getting volunteers to support the work that we were doing as legal aid programs on the ground, to make sure that there were attorneys who knew what they were doing, who were able to respond. At the time, I was the only attorney in our Pensacola office, and I certainly needed as much help as I could get. And just, again, talking to my colleagues in Central Florida who are dealing with much of the same work and challenges really helped us to build that network when we partnered with the YLD and their volunteers.
Thanks, Leslie. I wanted to go back to this photo here of Andrew, because again, I failed to mention, I talked about this new agreement, and so this new agreement was kind of a, beefed up. We got more funding, more expectations of which each side is going to bring to the table. One of the provisions in there, and I don't know if it was, intentional at the time, but they put in a provision on this new agreement that this program, so the ABA's YLD's program, would not provide advice or representation on matters that are adverse to any federal, state, or local government. And so at the time, and I don't know if just the laws were different, the available benefits, or the nature of how these cases are worked, it wasn't really a big issue or a big concern. That became a huge issue as we fast forward to Hurricane Katrina, and I'll talk about this in a second. Kind of go back to some of those other storms in Florida, but the agreement with FEMA and the YLD states that the YLD is the exclusive coordinator of legal services. And so a lot of people kind of get hung up or confused with that. It doesn't mean that the YLD is the only one helping disaster survivors. And in fact, the pro bono response to helping those in needs is probably, a handful of percent of the work that's being done. And the real, heroes that are doing this day in and day out is the legal aid attorneys, the LSC grantees, and the other, access to justice commissions across the country. What that agreement does when it says we're the exclusive coordinator is that we have the agreement with FEMA, and so we are kind of the funnel point for that information. And so, as Leslie was saying, this started to creep up as being an issue, because I think there was a change in sentiment of attorneys being at these recovery centers. And this predates me by many years, but anecdotally I've heard from other attorneys that were working during this time. And it was almost kind of maybe this sense of hostility of like, we don't want the attorneys in there because they're going to tell us, well, FEMA made a wrong decision. You have to go sue FEMA, or you have to appeal that determination. And so I think one of the unintended consequences is that a lot of the legal aid programs factioned off from coordinating with ABA, because they said, well, we're not subject to that agreement. We're not ABA, we're not YLD. We're here from legal aid, and we don't have any contract with you. And so I think that was kind of a setback, which was resolved through the courts years later. But I skipped over a couple slides here. Leslie, did you have anything else for some of these other storms here? This was Leslie's contribution, and I used the cartoons for Wilma and Dennis for Dennis the Menace. So
yeah, no, it just the only other the thing that I would add, because I know we have a lot of non-legal responders on the call today, is the 2004 and 2005 storms were also the first opportunity that we really started looking at long-term recovery committees and the value of what those meant in community partnerships. And I can't say enough, and I'm glad you're giving me a chance to add this. Those partnerships are so invaluable. Every storm that has hit Florida, and in particular, I can speak to North Florida since 2004, partnerships with the long-term recovery committees and the other nonprofits that have built out of the storms. I saw Lynn Dobry as a participant on this call. She's with Brace out of Escambia. Be Ready Alliance Coordinating for Emergencies is what that stands for. And they were a nonprofit that developed out of Hurricane Ivan to support those recovery efforts, and have literally been on the ground for everything that smelled like a disaster or community impact. Since then, they were supportive for every major storm, Deepwater Horizon, tornadoes, COVID, obviously. And I know that similar models of that have come to exist throughout the Panhandle and throughout the rest of Florida, and I have to imagine throughout the rest of the country. And those partnerships are so critical to getting the information about where DRCs, where disaster recovery centers are going to be set up, who's in need of help from other partners, really just serving a bridge with others who are seeing clients, potential clients, and those with legal needs in the community. What you see in front of you is just a cleaner version of the paths for the 2004 storms. And then I love Andrew's next slide where he has Wilma and Dennis. Dennis hit the Panhandle just east of Pensacola in 2005. And then Wilma actually did this little swirl and came around Key West and then took a curve to the northeast to strike Miami from the backside through the Everglades, and really created a lot of devastation in that area in 2005. Again, an area that really had not had a significant storm since 1992. So that's 13 years. And from my then former colleagues down at Legal Services Greater Miami and Dade County Legal Aid and Broward and others, just really shared the importance of all of those partnerships. And it was, again, an opportunity for us to really build out the knowledge that so many of us had learned in 2004.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, my cartoons here are factually incorrect, and they should be on the opposite sides.
You know, Wilma's actually pretty good. Wilma came from, she ended up coming from that direction, but Dennis, yeah, it looks good. I love it. It's hysterical.
True to his name, he's just not cooperating. So, okay, so, you know, our marquee event, Hurricane Katrina, most people, when they think of disasters, they think of Hurricane Katrina and all of the troubles that the agency FEMA had with that. And I don't know if, you know, there's surely a lot of criticism to go around. You know, after 9/11, they created, you know, Department of Homeland Security, and they pulled FEMA out of, the name's escaping me. They pulled FEMA out of their agency and put it into Homeland Security. And they say that's one of the big, and that's where it is still today, and remains to be one of the big criticisms of the program, is that it's just completely inflexible because of where it's housed. But Katrina was a big event. I mean, we could speak for hours and hours about the impact that's had on the community just for years and years. I mean, Laura Tuggle may be on the call here, but she was, you know, she would say that 10 years after Hurricane Katrina issues were still coming into their legal aid agency. And those are directly related. That could be a FEMA recoupment. That's not even to think of the impact that could have had and what that may have caused. It may have caused domestic violence. It could have caused divorce or eviction, and that led to other issues down the road. So a lot of these could be rooted in that event. Sadly, a lot of these people from Katrina, when they were relocated, they ended up in Houston. And so in 2017, they were hit by Hurricane Harvey. And so there's people that lived through the worst days of Katrina only to have to go through that again 12 years later in Houston. And so, again, there's just not enough time to talk about our response here. But one of the things, again, we use that hotline approach, and we partnered up, and partnerships, again, are incredibly important. And I believe Lafayette Bar hosted the hotline for a certain period of time before LSU took it over and they were able to employ law students. So this is one of the early iterations of a response where law students were used to help respond to the disaster. At the time, and again, I had mentioned, people like Judge Bloom, Mike Bedke, Hillary Bass, all kind of got their experience working in this area very early on in their career. Frank Nooner was, at the time, he was the Louisiana State Bar president. You may know Frank Nooner. He's now one of the newest board members of Legal Services Corporation. And what he did after Hurricane Katrina was set up kind of a mobile command center in his office in Lafayette. He reached out to some of the people in Texas who had a lot of experience working in this area. And they got to work. They put together binders. I think they said they put together over 500 binders to pass out to pro bono volunteers. The DLS director at the time was Craig Cannon. He worked at I think the firm was Womble Carlisle. I don't know if it's still in existence today or under a different name, but him and his firm were very instrumental. They really supported his work in it. And I think he actually took like a 6-month sabbatical from his normal job and was in New Orleans to help with this title clearing project. And so the work that they did with that, both with legal aid in that community was quite remarkable. And one thing to note too is that, again, timing is very important. The legal needs they were there right after Katrina, but really a lot of these issues were not being worked until 2006. So 12 months after the incident, that's when the volunteers were really needed. We saw that same issue after Hurricane Harvey. Is these events get a lot of national attention, especially now with Facebook, Twitter, social media, and everything. So every event, even the misses, some people living out on the far east end of North Carolina wouldn't say Dorian was a miss, but it was not as bad as intended. But it was, these are high level. Get lots of media attention, and people, they want to help. And so they say, yes, I will help. But then when you call them to help, they say, well, I'm on to something else. We saw that after Hurricane Harvey, 2,500, I've said this stat so many times, 2,500 people sign up, about 15% actually ended up taking a case. So you look at those other, 2,200, 2,300 people that didn't take a case, they went from wanting to help, and really what they did was cause significantly more harm, because a pro bono coordinator is going to say, we got enough. We're going to send off, close our intake for volunteers. And then we call on them and they're not there. So it turns out we don't have enough volunteers, and now we're at a point where we should be getting cases out, and now we have to go back and try to recruit volunteers. And so messaging is important. If you are a volunteer or work to recruit volunteers, let them know, the second after an earthquake, a fire, flood, hurricane, whatever it may be, that's when they want to help. And I always tell people, if you want to help right now, open up your checkbook, and day one is the time to give money. 6 months from now is the time to give time. And so, after Katrina, I think we had, these events like Andrew, Katrina. You have these events which really bring the legal, the disaster community together. But then you may see some of these periods of time in which it's kind of calm. And so people move on, that institutional knowledge goes away, and you kind of get complacent. And so I think that may have been the case a little bit in the last couple of years, maybe prior to 2014, is that we didn't see a tremendous amount of disasters like we've seen in the last couple of years. And so since Hurricane Katrina, well, let me take a step back. So I talked about that agreement after Hurricane Andrew. And so the provision in there that did not allow attorneys to take cases that were adverse to FEMA or the government. So that became an issue because there was legal aid programs after Katrina, specifically in Texas, that were provided access to these disaster recovery centers. And Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid actually I believe they filed 2 lawsuits, one of which was, one of the issues was access to these recovery centers. And the coordinator at the time Craig Cannon, he actually had to testify in this and talk about the Disaster Legal Services Program. And after that, the judge, I think, said, you all got to figure it out. And shortly after that, in 2007, they came up with a new agreement. And so I think now we have a much more cooperative engagement with FEMA. But let's see here. Leslie, how am I doing on time here? Good. Okay. So again, we're skipping a lot here. This is actually out in American Samoa. And one of the things to kind of talk about too is that, our program helps people in all 50 states and territories. We've had disasters almost every square foot of the United States and its territories. I think there's only a handful of states, and that just may be because we don't have the institutional tracking of some of these other states that haven't had it, but we've had disasters declared in responses in Guam, Saipan. Saipan was actually the first disaster I had to respond to. I had no idea what Saipan was, where it was. I had to go on Google and figure it out, and I was like, that's a long, long way away. This is from American Samoa, which is also a long, long ways away, and I actually went out to American Samoa in April of 2018, and really kind of shows you the scope of the program and how we can be effective. American Samoa has a population of about 50 or 60,000 people. They have a poverty level that's twice the national average. A lot of the there's not a lot of attorneys there to begin with, but the ones that are really private practitioners, they don't make a lot of money because the island is so poor. And so the pro bono community there really was somewhat non-existent. I think they had probably about 12 to a dozen private attorneys on the island. And so we kind of, employed this remote FEMA appeals clinic that we did virtually with the help of Linda Anderson Stanley, who's now the director of the Disaster Legal Services Program, and Florida resident. I was going to say Florida native, but Florida resident, and Amanda Brown, who's based in Louisiana, another disaster-prone state. And through the three of us, just through using Google Sheets, Google Forms, recruited volunteers and connected them with disaster survivors out in the territory. Tremendous in terms of the challenges, because I think it's like 14-hour time difference. They speak, most of them speak English, but their native language is Samoan. Their property system is completely different. They use a chiefly system. 90% of the land is considered, is not private land. And so they use these communities, and they have a chief, which is called a matai, that handles a lot of disputes. So it's a completely, different, overlay when you're overlapping administrative law and appeals with FEMA with that system. But nevertheless, I think that program, we helped on, I think at least maybe somewhere around 100 or 150 appeals out in the territory. And so that, again, kind of shows you the whatever it takes approach that we have to this program. And then, kind of fast forward, this is from Michael, but I think this is really kind of symbolic of the many disasters in Florida over the last 5 years, starting with Hermine, Matthew, Michael, Irma, all of them that kind of came to fruition around that time. And that's really when I started to come up through this program. And again, why those partnerships are so important in playing nice with others. When I came in, I think Florida's made leaps and bounds developments in their partnerships over the last couple of years, but that's not to say that they didn't exist. I think they probably were very strong after Andrew. They were probably strong after Dennis and Wilma, but maybe there's periods there where there's some lulls, there's the turnover. And so welcoming people to the circle, I always say have good sandbox etiquette, bringing people into the fold. I think a lot of people want to help. And coordination is critical. Duplication should be avoided at all costs. So and I think that kind of gets us to where we're at right now. I do have a couple more comments about kind of how the program works in general, but I wanted to give Leslie an opportunity to kind of weigh in on where we're at now.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo what you just said, because I think those partnerships have gotten stronger, and I think that everyone involved is really recognizing that we need to do better to maintain them in blue skies times when we're not having a storm. With Hurricane Hermine, which actually sort of came through Tallahassee, where I am now, back in 2015, and then Matthew, I think, was 16, and then Hurricane Irma was 2017. We've been able to, we now know as a legal aid community who our Florida Bar YLD representative is, and we know who our ABA YLD representative is. Through Irma and Michael, I was on the phone during landfall with the YLD representative from the Florida Bar. At the time, I was serving as the chairperson of the disaster umbrella group that I mentioned earlier, and that was the connection that we had, and just trying to figure out what the needs were and to serve as a conduit between the two programs to make sure we were communicating well. Hurricane Michael, which I think this is Mexico Beach that you've got a picture of here. The panhandle, again, is a little bit remote for most of Florida, and it's hard for people to get to, but there were volunteer attorneys taking cases through the YLD program from all parts of Florida, and that link and that support, where if they needed someone to be in court when they couldn't get there, and being able to really communicate and share those resources was vital to the clients that we were all serving, and we were trying to help all in recovery efforts. And that relationship has continued. I noticed we've got a few of our Florida Bar representatives participating in the call today. And again, we're grateful for that maintained partnership and for y'all continuing to work with us, and are grateful to be able to work with y'all in this recovery, because it takes all of us to really make this happen, and to make sure that we're getting those legal services out to people. There is one unique issue that kind of came out of Michael that I don't think we had seen before in terms of legal issues that I wanted to hit on, and it might be geographical, because we had a lot of people with Hurricane Michael who simply had to relocate, but they had relocation orders in their custody orders that said they couldn't move more than 50 miles for more than 30 days away from their home. And that was one of the most immediate emergencies, is people had places to go in Georgia and Alabama and other neighboring states, but couldn't do it because they had court orders in their custody, in their family law cases, that prevented it. And there was a really phenomenal response on the ground with the Bay County Bar Association responding to that need and setting up a clinic in the parking lot at Walmart to make sure that those needs were met. And so really just some amazing volunteer efforts across the board, and with us, being able to support and be supported by that, it's as legal aid programs, it makes the entire response so much more complete.
And so I guess we maybe have some time for a couple of questions. Just kind of, I just wanted a quick talk about our standing committee. So briefly, after Hurricane Katrina, much like after kind of the pandemic, the ABA created this task force to address the legal needs of just actually to look at the association's level of preparedness. And so the ABA has two main disaster programs. One is the YLD program, which is really coordinating the services, and the committee really kind of deals with almost everything else. We're dealing with policy, resolutions, programming. We just had our virtual symposium last month, and all those programs are up on our website. It's the small committee. Our charter only allows us to have 9 members, but we need 9,000 members to do all the work that needs to be done here. So just because you're not a member of that committee or even of the ABA, we need partnerships. We need to work with people. We need to hear the issues that are happening. One of the criticisms that I think our own committee has, that I think we're kind of siloed into individual assistance, and disaster response and recovery is so much more than that. There's the public assistance program, there's hazard mitigation, preparedness, resiliency. There's lots of things to work on. So Florida is probably, they're definitely on the podium. They probably have the gold medal when it comes to disaster preparedness. You all, Louisiana, Texas, you have very involved communities. You have lots of legal aid organizations and nonprofits that are working I think Volunteer Florida, Christy Rojas was on one of our programs. No shortage of people that are passionate about that work. And so I would encourage you all to go to our Standing Committee's website. You can just go on Google and type in Standing Committee on Disaster Response and Preparedness. We have lots of good materials there for resiliency, disaster planning for solos and small firms, and really get engaged with us and keep the conversation going. Kathy, do we have any questions?
No, I think we may, and we had one question about what is YLD.
Very good question. So
yeah.
I should have answered that one about 53 minutes ago. Great question. So YLD is the Young Lawyers Division. Like I said, Linda Anderson Stanley is the current director of that. And I think if you look at the programming, you're going to see more information about that. The 60-second summary of the program is that, you know, through the Stafford Act, that is your body of federal disaster law. There's something in there, a specific provision for disaster legal services. When the president declares a federal disaster declaration, there's lots that goes into that before that happens. There's a provision in there that if FEMA requests our assistance, they will send us a letter of intent, and that starts to begin our expectations and our obligations on both sides. They're going to give us $5,000 to stand up a hotline, and then that program will start to try to mobilize volunteers. And now because of COVID, it's a little bit strange because the model used to be, you know, getting people in the recovery centers, and now those pretty much aren't happening because of COVID, but that also gives rise to tremendous opportunities in the future because just by virtue of this program right here, I should be standing in Florida, counting down the minutes and hours until I was going to be on a beach somewhere with a Mai Tai, but instead I'm in chilly Chicago over Zoom. So not great for my desire to be on a beach somewhere, but great because we have greater capacity, I think, and acceptance of doing things in a remote environment. So that's a teaser for Linda's program. Lots of good stuff going on with that, especially some of the developments that they've had just in the last year with really taking that program further. So definitely check that out.
And Andrew, one thing I'd just like to add, because you mentioned that if there's a declaration, then and disaster legal services are ordered, that the YLD will sort of take on that role. Hurricane Sally hit the Florida-Alabama line about just a few weeks ago, and there is not a declaration yet that includes disaster legal services. There is actually not a declaration yet that includes individual assistance. So there are certainly disasters where that contract doesn't come necessarily into play, but it doesn't mean the response is ignored or doesn't come into play. So I know that we've already been in communication with our friends at the Florida Bar about what happens when that declaration does happen. You know, we're working with our partners on the ground about what information is missing and why that declaration has not yet happened. I don't know if this is a change in policy about what it takes to declare a disaster for emergency for individual assistance. At this point, I do know from the folks in Texas that Hurricane Hannah earlier this year did not receive that level of a declaration. And I'm sure in one of the presentations in this series, we'll talk more about the difference between individual assistance and the public assistance that goes to the governments and to critical agencies and organizations within a community to help in that recovery effort. But the individual assistance is what goes to the individuals, to the people who lost their homes, who lost their belongings, who have damage that they're trying to repair, and for crisis counseling, things like that, and disaster legal services is one of them. So there's still more to the story, I guess, is my larger point.
Absolutely. And those declarations they do what's called the preliminary damage assessment, and they essentially look at what is the uninsured loss. And so you could have more significant events in terms of catastrophic loss, but you know, I think that's what they're seeing right now out in California, where you're having 15 different fires, and these declarations are county specific, but some of these fires, they're not treated as, you know, the quote unquote California fires. It's the, you know, it's the Butte fire, the Wood fire, whatever it may be. And so they impact different counties. And if there's not an uninsured loss, that would trigger that assistance, they might not get a declaration. And what we see in the Midwest is that it takes a long time, maybe 6 weeks or even more, to get that declaration. Whereas in Florida, a lot of these are like, marquee events where you're getting that declaration a day or two later. So it is a struggle. It's why you have to talk before, during, and after the disaster, because we don't want to come into, Florida 8 weeks after the incident, say, hey, we're here to help. And everybody's like, well, where were you 7.5 weeks ago? So again, lots more to talk about here. Kathy, I know your job is to start on time and end on time, and I'm making that hard to do. So I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you. We don't have any more questions. So I think we can call it a webinar and end today. And thank you, Leslie and Andrew, for joining today. One thing that really struck out to me as I listened to y'all was when you went over the history, is how much our relationship of legal services and legal aid has improved over the years with our partnership with our non-legal partners, with FEMA, with different religious groups and nonprofits and our emergency managers. So it's that's a good thing that can only benefit the survivors of the various disasters. And sometimes in Florida, we think it's all hurricanes, but it's not all hurricanes all over the country, and it's actually not all hurricanes in Florida. So thank everybody for joining. Come back next Thursday at noon. We'll be talking about consumer protection for survivors of disaster and during disasters and before disasters with Laura Beckman from Assistant Attorney General here in Florida. And I'll send you all the information about the webinar, any material that we have, CLE information, and a copy of the recording the first of next week. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you, Leslie and Andrew. And Carlin, bye-bye.
Everyone.
Take care, everyone.